Hey there, tech people and the adapters and the adapters tech folk out there. Here's another great episode of the adapters. And I'm delighted to have our friend Wayne Walker join us. He is a leading expert in the world of boards and governance and, some complicated situations. There's some very normal situations that we're going to have some fun with today and talk about those and lots of tips and takes through this. And we're going to learn these key points. We're going to learn what is a board, what is governance. We're going to hear about what makes a great culture. How does a chairman guide? How does a chairman of a board or a board member participate in the operation of the business and inspiring those that run the business to do great things? And it's great to have you, Wayne. And Wayne, we're here on the podcast, and what always strikes me about your experience, and every time we talk, and we've known each other a while, is that the depth and breadth of your experience across multiple types of boards, ranging from, you know, some stuff that's probably pretty interesting because it deals with police forces and other types of institutions like that, products that they produce, as well as philanthropic and the world of philanthropy is amazing. Considering also you were the chairman of Habitat for Humanity and traveling around the world, and equally hospitality companies, tech companies, a full range boards of education in Philadelphia. How do you do it all? How do you get your head around all these diverse types of institutions, Wayne?
Well, Sean, let me thank you for the opportunity to be on here today. I really appreciate it. But when it comes to boards, no matter the industry, you got fundamental talents and skill sets that would be needed. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to make a good judgment, have good business judgment. But whether you're a lawyer or a finance person or an industry, I mean, all those transferable obligations of being a good fiduciary with those backgrounds will transcend whatever the industry would be.
And so you're transcendent, are you? Is that what we're talking about, Wayne? But also, Wayne, I know you're like the odd drop of wine. Is that your comfort food out there? I know I'm not transitioning very well for everybody that's listening, but he also likes a good glass of wine, and I guess that's a good way to loosen up a board too,
Well,
is it? Go out for a glass of wine.
rumor
You
has it
guys do that
that
at
two
board?
glasses of red wine is good for you. Now, there are other more medicinal consequences. It can kind of disarm people and create a camaraderie that will hopefully create goodwill. So when the time of challenge come, everybody is in a mindset to help each other, as opposed to thinking there are multiple agendas all over the place. So there's some.
And now, do you invite the management team to those soirees as well?
Well, we're interdependent. Board setting a policy, management carrying it out, and you got to work together. So obviously, it's critical for board and management to interact. And then there are times when you kick board management out of the room.
Is that kind of like the U.S. government, where there's the president and Congress, and one sets policy and the other sometimes ignores it, and sometimes they just embrace it? Is that how it works?
Well, you call it branches of government. I guess ultimately we have two instead of three. You forgot the judiciary at the U.S. level. But ultimately,
Mm,
we have to work together. It doesn't mean always agreeing
mm.
because you want the diversity and you want a little tension. But what it does mean to be effective, then you got to reach a decision and then implement that together.
So when you think about the practical stuff that boards do, like investments, or the management is saying we want to change direction, and here's our investment criteria, or here's our investment thesis. How does a board engage with that type of question that says, "Hi, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, Chairperson, we've got an idea to change direction here." How, where do you start with how to present that to a board?
Ultimately, if the CEO or management wants to change direction or whatever they want to do on a material scale, there are two ways to address it. If there's a committee of the board, which would have original jurisdiction over, strategies or new ideas and new
Right.
products, and go to that committee first and then engage at that level. And if it's not, then, the alternative is just to make a presentation to the board, and then the board will decide on how best to take that to the next level, whether that's through an existing committee or an ad hoc committee. But a reason that I'm talking about committees is that it allows a deeper dive, by a few members of the board rather than the board, taking its, meeting that will be on an, quarterly basis or whatever the frequency may be. So it allows real deep diving to allow the board then to read and listen and then make a good business decision.
There's different types of boards out there. In startups, and obviously we have Adapters Tech X, and we do a lot on startups. They have advisory boards, or they have advisory committees, and then there's fully constituted boards that you've served on. In your, what's the difference for our listeners on the difference between an advisory board and then a constituted board?
Well, so when you think of a constituted board, to use that term, when owners create a company, they need a board of directors, typically to govern it. And that board has legal obligations, fiduciary obligations under law to act in the best interests of the organization. So sometimes boards say, we need additional input. And rather than necessarily making, the constituted board 1,000 people, or 20, 30 people, they may say, what? Here's some people who got the skills that we need. They're willing to help, but they're not necessarily have all the time that we need. But they're willing to give us advice and just be a sounding board, so to speak. A sounding resource. And then so we would
Mm-hmm.
use that
Yeah.
group, as more on a contract basis in the context of not vis-a-vis a legal basis, because they won't necessarily carry, the legal fiduciary obligations of the board elected by the shareholders. So there's a difference.
So it's easier, right? An advisory board is more flexible. They come and go depending on the topic, but they don't have the same fiduciary responsibility as a constituted, with that type of governance, right?
Correct. They don't have the fundamental legal obligations. However, when it comes to public policies, as a society, their conduct could get them into trouble, but we don't want to go down that road. But another thing you talked about startup boards.
You always got a good story when there's some type of board member that's kind of strayed off the tracks, but we won't go there. I won't even ask you for an example, but maybe later.
So what do you say? Well, what was your point?
My point being is, once they stray off the tracks, that's not for this show. But there's some good stories there, I'm sure. So as you kind of moved up and in your career, and you moved, from private to public boards, what's the big difference between being on a private board, and what's the definition of that? And when you go onto a public board, or a listed company board for those down around the world, what's the difference, and what's the pressures that board members experience? And you're a chairman; you've been chairman of both, and so how define those for us, please.
So when you think about a private board or a private company, It means that the ownership, the shares are not, sold publicly. So, for example, I'm on a company now where family members pretty much own the stock. They don't try to list it on a public exchange such as New York Exchange or NASDAQ to market those securities, those ownership shares to people at the public at large. And as a result of that, they get the privilege to run their business without a lot of the regulatory scrutiny that's required when you're taking shares and selling them, to the public at large. In which
Hmm.
case,
Hmm.
you have a public company, and so public companies are is like living in a fishbowl in the sense that you got all kinds of regulations that govern your integrity, that govern controls, that set up different standards of what committees you got to have, that require levels of independence, all those type of rules, and for a good reason. Uh, you want to make sure that the public gets a fair shake and an honest shake at what's going on in a company, and that those who are inside are not taking advantage of various things available to them and not available to the public. For example, you're an insider, you know that about doing acquisition, you go out and buy stock or sell stock or whatever the consequence may be.
Hmm.
That's material. The public doesn't know that. So that's why, in that fishbowl and with those regulations, they will have a blackout period that would prohibit, certain conduct so that when things are made available publicly, then everybody will have the same opportunity, at making a decision on whether to invest, whether to disinvest, whether to do whatever you want to do. So the big thing is how much you have to disclose, private versus public. Now, just because you're private, though, doesn't mean you don't have obligations as a director to shareholders, because you do. It's just that it's in a different context. Fundamental shareholder rights of minority shareholders or those who feel that they aren't being treated, properly or given proper information can still be governed and are still governed by laws that create corporations. So it's more like you get a little bit more intensity and publicity at the publicly owned level,
Hmm.
but you have some of the same obligations still from a legal standpoint at the privately owned level as well.
So in our other show, right, when we chatted at our quick hit, it was interesting. They were talking about the conversation about how do you manage the CEO and those relationships. But here's a question for you: what happens when you got a board member that's just not a good fit, and you have to deal with that as the chairman of the board? I mean, how do you deal with that inside? Give us the inside scoop on how that works.
Well, I've had the unfortunate privilege of asking a few directors to leave the board. Uh, it's never fun because the whole idea is to give presumption, but there become issues where you got two mechanisms to deal with it. You have a nominations and governance committee typically, whose charge is to address, you know, director conduct, director performance. And so you evaluate directors. And then you also got a chair of that committee. You may have a separate chairman of the board. And the question is how best to address that director. And, I've done it in the role as chair of a governance committee. I've done it in the role of chair of, of, uh, of the board. The key is to have a direct discussion about what the issues are and whether there's a path of working together or whether it'd be beneficial for all for that director to leave the board. Uh,
Hmm.
Hopefully, you'd have a situation where it's a face saving exit, where a director departs and there's no acrimony, public discourse, to bring about the resolution. But you still have to have a functioning board. And in the event that a board director doesn't resign and you don't want to go publicly against the individual, well, there are term limits. Another mechanism is simply not to renominate the person. Let them ride out their tenure and call it a day. But the hope is that recognizing the situation and given the type of it, if a director doesn't want to politely leave, then there are ways the board can, change. If you can't kick them off under, state law, you can certainly change their roles. You can, have executive sessions without them. So there are different things with the proper notice, but there are different things you can do. But the hope is that a direct would recognize that we've reached the end of the road for these legitimate reasons based on your conduct or performance or non-performance, and let's do the right thing.
So in essence, it's very runs parallel with an employee within the organization that's not on the board. You can move them around in different jobs. You can ask them to leave. You can force them to leave. So the principles of fair play and following the rules and following all the laws and saving face could equally apply within the organization at the what the CEO runs versus what the chairperson is responsible for with dealing the board, right? I mean, there's a lot of parallels there.
There are, and the thing about it, if you're in a public company, the reason you want to be so sensitive because different decisions can impact,
Hmm.
the value of the company.
Like the perception, like we've seen that in many markets as an example where there's a change at the top in the market and the market reacts in some way. And is that largely because of communication, or is it largely what's the reason why the markets would react?
Based on what they perceive to be the role of the and value of the person, that's leaving the board.
If I give you an example of that, is it the right way to think that says if the chairman was asked to leave, that's different than the board member who is in charge of compensation, the sub chair of the compensation committee? Would that be the extremes?
No, I think that would generate more questions because it may be a disclosable
If the
event,
chairman was
or
asked to leave versus
yes, the chairman versus a
a
board member
member.
who plays a less visible role to the market. But if you talk about a public company, when you, at least in the U.S., when you have to file, an 8K telling, why this person left, there would be a question as to whether there are any disagreements. And if the answer is no, that would kind of give some sense of calm and you could come up with all kinds of reasons, why a person could leave a role.
So it's good communication, having that message to the market, what's going on, without being having defamation cases hanging over your head or anything like that, or those potentials. But it's about managing the message when that occurs, right?
Internally and externally.
So if we could, Wayne, talk about some more macro stuff that I know probably you might be dealing with this on some of the boards and that you're currently on. So we're in a world now of inflation. We're in the world of energy crisis. We've got, all sorts of moving parts across the globe between changes in administrations. I mean, if you look at the UK as an example, we've had some changes in what less than 40 days. The chancellor is gone. There's stuff going on in China. There's stuff going on in Russia. I mean, it's kind of volatile right now. How are without disclosing anything that's private and confidential, is how are you guiding boards and working with your companies to manage this volatility and make sense of it? Maybe that's a bad question how I'm framing it, but I'm really trying to understand how the board gets involved and supports or guides during these periods of significant volatility.
We are in a turbulent world. A lot of things just have hurt us. The pandemic, people's new ways of working from home versus from being from a location. Logistics, all these different things that are now impacting businesses. So what do? We're trying to figure out what are our risks. Supply chain are risk for the business. What about the workforce? A lot of people say, well, I don't want to go back to an office. you know, I want to stay at home. So what about? So you get all these issues, and so what we try to do is to ask management, what are the critical things that we must ensure to be in place to keep us delivering value to all of our shareholders? What about product quality? What about delivery? What about talent? What about even pricing? So do we have backup plans? What about delivery? And how do we address shareholders? One of the things that, in today's climate is going to be, how do you raise capital? If you need additional capital, with the market being, so topsy-turvy and seemingly on the slide downward. So what we do is we just have a candid discussion. And this is also, Sean, where it's important to have the right talent on the board. It's also important where it's good to have an advisory board if you have one, the right talent there. And if you don't have all that you need in both of those places, you also are, encouraged to engage others who can come to the board and talk about the economy, who can talk to the board and talk about, well, it's, environmental, social, and governance. So all those different things, you can have people to come in and educate the board. So let's remember, the board is not deemed to be an expert. What the board is required to do is to make sure it has adequate information from which to make a judgment, and to make sure it does not usurp a corporate opportunity for themselves individually. And then use that information, and ask questions. And if those answers require more due diligence, then you get the due diligence done, whether that's through a committee of the board or through hiring experts directly to come to the board. So we have to be responsible for governing. And that requires getting the people in the room who, if you ask me, whose livelihood depend on the subject matter, to talk about it.
Yeah, it's interesting that we get into that, the right people in the room, and so when we think about how the right people get in the room and the right diversity gets in the room, as you know, there's continued controversy over the mix of boards, public and private, whether they got the right mix of different genders, races, perspectives. How do you influence that? And what's your opinion on what that road looks like ahead in getting boards to reflect their communities and reflect their workforces, their suppliers, their stakeholders, in other words?
I hate to use this example, but I'm going to use it.
We're going to use it anyway, so let's do it.
But if I'm a commander-in-chief, I want an Air Force, I want an Army, I want a Navy. I want Navy SEALs. I
You
want
want all the branches,
I
all the
want all the
branches.
branches. And because with all the branches, I can deploy which branch I need when I need it to help bring the desired outcome. Not only that, I have all the branches in the same room and we can discuss among ourselves which is the best tool or strategy with which to move forward. And to me, that's how I look at boards. If there's the old phrase, if everybody is agreeing, then only one person is thinking. I want to have the diversity on the board where you get all kinds of thoughts, all kinds of frames of reference, all kinds of backgrounds needed to make that board whole. And to me, that means inclusion as opposed to exclusion. And that's why it's important. You never know truly what people believe and what their individual frames of references have been in their lives. But what we do know is those beliefs and those references often shape the way people behave, which is why it's critical for the board to have a strong foundation of values that we share so that we can look at different tools and different contributions and different backgrounds and different thoughts as assets as opposed to liabilities.
But when we think about boards and maybe hitting this head on, there's very few women relative to men on boards. Why do we think that is? What's
I
driving?
not to be trite, I guess it's a numerical thing, but the point is that you don't know what people believe, and sometimes the result of those beliefs manifest themselves, and maybe that's why there's traditionally been fewer women and fewer blacks and fewer.
So just clarifying, so nobody misinterprets your comment. Are you saying that it's a belief system on boards that they shouldn't have women in there, or there's a bias, or is that? I just want to make sure that we're getting your perspective on that.
Let's be clear. I'm not speaking for the whole world. We're just talking about what could be reasons. I don't know if there's you know, I don't know if there is a general rule that people hold to say no women, no African Americans, no Asian, no Latinos. We don't know what people's frame of references are and what their beliefs are. But we do know is what some of the outcomes have been. The outcomes have been fewer of those groups on these boards. And the way we change that is twofold. One, a value, having established values that say that we need this diversity, so that we can have strength and be able to employ the talent that we need. You know, that's one way to do it, values. Two is, I hate to say it, but legislatively. And there are some states, look, NASDAQ, I think, is one that requires a certain number of diverse people on boards. And the presumption is that, and hope, is that in working together, whatever may have been the reasons for limiting the participation, now indicates why it's so critical to have it. I used to work at a company in the legal department, and we would always have white shoe law firms. We call them white shoe. They're conservative and large, and mostly white male as their partners and everything. But what we realized that when it came to some of the urban areas, where we had our white shoe law firms only representing us, we lost. All of a sudden, when we started diversifying and using, women and African Americans and others, we start getting different results. Because you got to have a team, and I'm not saying that it's strictly because of an individual gender or race, but you also got to have a team that can bring the multiple experiences, the multiple approaches, the multiple interactions as a basis from which to carry out your work. And if everything is the same, you got to keep getting the same, like to get the same results. So I think that we should look at diversity. I certainly do, as an asset and a way to help deliver greater values to shareholders. And they trickle down, throughout the organization. If a board has a a commitment of diversity and inclusion or certain values, then those values go through the organization. If the board has a climate of we want to have innovation. We want people to talk about things. We don't mind disagreeing. They make us stronger. When the board sets those kind of tones and say at the end of the day we're still one company, then to me that creates the beauty and the success. You mentioned earlier that I'm now in London, and the strength of a London, as I walk around and look, is that so much diversity and the power of ideas, be that in finance, be that in art, be that just in just human decency. I'm not saying it's perfect, but the power of those ideas with that diversity, to me, would help a board create the success that it needs for everybody.
Yeah, as we start to wrap up the show, it's, as you said, it's great to have that mindset. And and we won't branch into this, but as we go into the world where we're talking about environmental, social governance, socially acceptable futures for all of us, to have diversity within our lives and in influence is part of the great change that we're going through right now. As you say, it's hugely volatile, but your perspective is very interesting on saying, it's a beautiful thing when it has to come from the top. The mindset change has to come from the top, and that includes the board as well as the management team. They're not mutually exclusive. Is that the right way to think about it? They're integrated.
Yes. I got a mathematical formula for the success of a company. And when I look at the board and management, my mathematical formula is 1 board plus 1 management equals 1. 1 plus 1 equals 1. One company, one firm, one brand. Everybody is interdependent. I think that's my formula for success. It doesn't mean that we don't disagree. It doesn't mean that we don't have knockout fights. It doesn't mean that we're all the time kumbaya. But it says that we start from a shared sense of that we're all trying to do what's best.
So positive friction to deliver a unified approach, right, to the public markets and to the teams.
Yeah.
It's hard to see a world where you have got. It's tough in a company when the board's out of sync or the management's out of sync with the board and they're out of sync. It's like mom and dad having, conflict. The kids understand it, but the kids see it, but they don't necessarily understand it. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting world. So if as we wrap up here, Wayne, and you've been a font of knowledge. You're traveling all the time. You live around the world. and you get to go out. So what's your after all these very difficult board meetings and or very positive board meetings make wind up in the same place? What's your favorite comfort food?
You
You
know,
know, end of a long day, go, oh my God, there was 7 hours in there. Where do you go? What do you do?
I'm a country boy from Macon, Georgia. I love chicken parmesan
So Macon, Georgia is in America,
in America.
and you're in London, and so where do you head? What's the comfort food there?
My comfort food, all right, little place down the street, great place down the street. I still love chicken parmesan. Give me some chicken parmesan, and I love, you can throw in the spinach and whatever else. And to your point, uh, a couple of healthy glasses of red, and we're good to go. We're good to go.
So can you really tell that it was tough? If it was tough, you have chick parm, and if it was good, you have chick parm. Is that right? Either way, all roads lead to chick parm, or is there some other food that covers the tough day?
When I think about it, all chicken parm is not the same. I'll tell you that. Yeah, let's be clear. All chicken. But my what's my next go-to food if I'm not gonna have chicken parmesan? I can't help it, but I do like hamburgers. Hamburger, hamburgers and fries. You give me throw a little sorbet with that. I know that doesn't hamburgers and sorbet don't seem to like go together, so I'll say ice cream instead. I'm good to go.
And do you have the wine with all of it? Is there wine with the hamburger and the chick parm, or does hamburger merit a different beverage?
Now, if it's hot, I might hit a beer, but if not, I'm good to go. Now, let's be clear. I do have meals without alcoholic beverages. So,
That's a caveat. So that does exist. Okay. Well. That's great, Wayne. And the last thing I'll ask you is there anything that you're reading right now that you'd recommend to our listeners? Say, look, read this. It was great. Could be an article. It could be anything that comes to mind
you know,
when you're sitting there with your chick parm and your glass of wine.
I just picked up a book recently here in London. It talks about clubs. And I'm reading it now because it's shedding what goes into the mindset, and because clubs were segregated, some are now integrated, and so I'm embarrassed to you know the author's name. I think the book is Behind Closed Doors, but I'm really enjoying it. On a separate note, if you I have an old movie that I love. And it's probably my most favorite. It's called The Omen, Omen. Back in 1978, I think it came out. Yeah, it was about good and evil. But the theme for me is not so much about, you know, the two sides. It was about the determination to persist no matter what the challenges were, and to stay focused and not get deterred no matter how high the climb would be. And so I would recommend just going back and looking at The Omen.
Okay, so we're gonna put the Omen, on you'll see it on the podcast. We'll put it on YouTube. So it's from 1976, and it was Gregory Peck and Lee Remick and a couple others that were in that. So there's the go-to spot for Wayne Walker between burgers, chick parm, and a movie, The Omen. There's lots of metaphors in there, and of course, washed down with at least two glasses of red wine. Wayne, it's been great to have you with us. And I know that we talked about some tips and takes, and it would be great for you to just, recount that a little bit for us as we wrap up. I think you had some tips and takes that we went through on the quick hit, and I think it's a valuable reminder to our listeners. So, finish us up here with some wise words.
Well, let me just say, Sean, thank you for having me on here. Very, very much. I appreciate the reach
Pleasure.
that you're doing. It's critical. If I look at wrap up ideas, some takeaways, I would say one, the board needs a strong foundation of solid values. Two, the board must have the right talent. Whether it's, industry executives, CEOs, CFOs, tech people, you need the right talent. And three, the board's got to have the right CEO and a solid, good, working, respectful relationship with that person. And the fourth thing, shared strategies and co-own. Not one imposed by the board or one imposed by the CEO, but one developed together with the board and management. And lastly, stay focused. Just stay focused.
That's a good way to wrap up today. Let's stay focused and jump on those tips and takes. Wayne, it's been great to chat with you. So everybody at Adapters and Adapters TechX, thanks for taking the time. Some valuable tips and takes there that I think we should all integrate into all of our lives in some form or fashion, about values, to putting the right people at the table with the right perspectives that aren't scared to share their view and participate in a positive way. So on that note, thanks to our friends at Questex and the annual hotel conference, Alexi Kajavi and team over there, and to Hunter Gatherer for producing, and our friends at No Vacancy in the United States, where we connect all the dots. So on that note, we're out, and don't forget, keep looking over the fence.